Good morning. It's great to see all of you here today on such a beautiful day. It's lovely to be here, isn't it? This is one of the things I like the most. A couple of announcements I wanted to make. I was excited to see Fabrice and to be able to, I think he's actually leaving now. The youth are heading for their session. So if there's any teenagers who are here, you can be dismissed to go and join him, and you'll have a discussion as you continue with our service here. So we have a space where our youth meet, they get to know each other, they get to discuss the same topics we look at here, but to see how they apply to their lives as teenagers, as youth, and the challenges that they have. So anyone who's here is dismissed to join them. And I was excited to see Fabrice here. I've had a chance to read his book, and I would recommend it to any of us who are interested in leadership or in God's calling and those questions. And there's a lot that he shares there, the insights that he's gained as he studied here, as he grew up in Congo. And I would recommend it to any of us who are interested in those topics. And I'm really excited to see, people in Karen who are growing as leaders, who are challenging themselves, who are writing, who are leading, who are ministering. And I hope as we grow as a church, we can continue to see that, and that more of us can be engaged in this type of thing. And it's one of the things that excites me the most about being here. One thing I wanted to add about the breakfast that's coming up on August 14th is that we're doing two things on that day. We're doing the breakfast. We're also doing our plug-in launch on the same day. So we're going to combine both of those events. So for those of you who have signed up for plug-in, you've been waiting, that's the day we're going to start. And if any of you have not signed up for plug-in, just as was announced earlier, you're free to sign up at the back, and you can come on that day, and then we'll continue from there with our sessions. And so that will be our plug-in launch in the service on that day, on August 14th. One other thing I wanted to mention before we go into our message for today has to do with something that was said last week about head coverings. And last week during our prayer session, there was a statement made, and I just want to clarify for all of us the position of Nairobi Chapel Karen on that issue. And as far as what we believe for that issue, we believe that in 1 Corinthians that Paul was referring to specific cultural issues of that time in Corinth. And that we don't hold head coverings to be mandatory, to be normative for women today. Now I recognize that there are different ways to look at this, there are different interpretations, and I would encourage all of us to read that passage in 1 Corinthians 11 to see what Paul is saying, what he means. But I just want to clarify that as a church, we believe that head coverings, you're free to wear them, you're free not to, but it'd be a matter of your preference and your style. But that we don't see them as normative or required. So that's our position as Nairobi Chapel Karen. And so if you had any other questions, you're welcome to come to me, and we can discuss that more. So this week we're moving to week 3. As a young person, he refused to compromise. He stood up for what was right, and he refused to eat the diet that was given to him. So we saw that in chapter 1. And then last week we moved to chapter 3. And chapter 3 is the story of the fiery furnace, which is the 3 friends of Daniel, who are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how they refused to bow to the image, but instead they were willing to be put through the fiery furnace to stand up for their faith and for worshiping their God alone. And so we looked at how we can be afraid of different things, but how we can overcome our fear and grow our faith in God. So we looked at that last week in Daniel chapter 13. And this week we're looking at Daniel chapter 6. Moving from Daniel chapter 3 to Daniel chapter 6. Unfortunately, we're not able to look at every single chapter as we go through. So please turn with me to chapter 6. And I'm going to read that for us today. So I'm going to read Daniel chapter 6. I'm going to read the whole chapter. So it says this, starting in verse 1. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them, so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities, that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel, in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever." The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king shall issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group. They found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. "Did you not publish a decree that in the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being, except for you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." Then they said to the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him in the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, who you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to the palace and spent his night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I done any wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and people of every language in all the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So this is another amazing chapter of Daniel, isn't it? There's a lot of amazing stories that are here. And to really understand this, we need to look at what happened in chapter 5. So in chapter 5, we have the story of this big feast that the Babylonians were having. And it was now a different ruler. It's no longer Nebuchadnezzar. It was now Belshazzar, who was the ruler of Babylon. And so he brought out even the ornaments and all the instruments that they had from the temple, the plates and all that kind of stuff that they took from the temple. They were using those. So as they had this feast, that's when there was a finger that wrote on the wall and he wrote the writing that their kingdom was found wanting and was going to perish. So Daniel was brought into the feast, he interpreted the writing on the wall, and that very night the kingdom fell. And so we have a dramatic transition that took place right before the story. So the Babylonian Empire is no longer, it was finished. And it was taken over by a new empire, the empire of the Medes and the Persians. So they are now the ones in charge. So what's happened is, if you remember from Daniel's dream, from Nebuchadnezzar's dream actually in chapter 2, he saw a dream with a statue. And so that statue represented 4 empires, which is the Babylonian Empire, the Media-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire. So we've moved from the first now to the second, from the Babylonian to the Media-Persian, which is the head of gold, now to the chest and the arms of silver. So that transition has happened. And one of the first things we see here in our story, as we've seen in most of the stories we've looked at so far, is a promotion. We see that Daniel is promoted. Not only is he kept in leadership, but he's actually moved higher. And he was already one of the top 3 at the beginning of the chapter. He was one of the top 3, but then he was moved to become number 1. So even of the 3 top rulers, he was the one in charge of them. And then all the other governors and lower level leaders that are under them report to the 3, and then they ultimately report to Daniel. So Daniel is the top person in this hierarchy, under Darius. He's the top leader and administrator. And one of the things people have debated is over who Darius is. Because there's actually not a Darius the Mede that you can find historically. So what people have realized, as they've looked at this, is that Darius is actually a title. So it's not so much a proper name as a title, the same way as Pharaoh or Caesar or King isn't a name, but it's a title that applies to multiple people. So there's several different people that were called Darius. So people debated over which one was in this story. And one of the views that has become popular now is that the Darius in this story is actually Cyrus. Cyrus the Persian. And if you look at the NIV, the new NIVs, they have a footnote on verse 28. And it says, another way to translate this verse, the Aramaic here, is instead of saying Darius, during the reign of Darius, and the reign of Cyrus, you can say Darius, that is the reign of Cyrus, meaning they are the same person. So as you go on and as you look more at Cyrus, Cyrus is actually the one who released the Israelites and allowed them to return to Judah. And we'll look at that a bit more as we continue. But I think it's truly amazing that when a new empire comes in, that not only would Daniel be kept on, but that he'd be given a new role. And normally, whenever a new empire comes in, you clean house. You don't keep any of the old rulers or systems that are there. You put in new ones. Because people who are working for the Babylonians are more likely to be loyal to the Babylonians. So you want to change things. And you think of even in our political system today, when new leaders come in, they usually clean house. They don't keep many people from before. But because Daniel was so excellent, he was so impressive and well respected, when they came in, they said, we can keep this guy and we can keep him in the same position. We can keep him in charge and even move him higher. And at this point in Daniel's life, he was about 85 years old when you come to chapter 6. He's about 85 or 90 years old. He's been in captivity for about 70 years from the time he was a teenager. So he's been in Babylon his entire life. And he's still serving, he's still in a very high, very senior role. But as we see in our passage, he's still having challenges. And even though he's very senior, he still has a problem. And this is what happened. So after Daniel was promoted, the people reporting to him did not take it very well. And they didn't appreciate that this foreigner was ruling over them. The same way some of the Babylonians didn't appreciate it in earlier passages. So they tried to figure out, what can we do to get rid of him? So they tried to look for any dirt they could find on him. And they tried to figure out, what has he done that we can use against him? So they tried to look through, are there any skeletons in his closet? What has he done that's wrong? Any corruption, any fault, any shady deals, anything. And they could not find anything. Now I think when we look at our leaders today and we think of all the different ways you can be caught in different scandals, it's amazing, isn't it? To be in public service your entire life at a very, visible level where many people can observe what you're doing and not find anything to trap you with. But that was his situation, so he was clean. So they couldn't find anything, within the normal legal system to catch him. So they had to come up with something else. So they actually had to pass a new law. Because Daniel was not ashamed of anything. He lived his life as an open book. And there was nothing that compromised him. So after his promotion, after this problem, we see they developed a plot. So they came up with this plot and they said, the only way we can trap Daniel is through his faith. That's his weak spot. That's the way we can catch him. So they actually wrote this new law just to catch him. And the idea of having an enemy, I thought about this passage this week. The idea of having an enemy who's so opposed to you, they're willing to write new laws to catch you, I just think is incredible. And I imagined if there's someone watching you, and then they're trying to catch you, and say they're watching you drive, yeah? So they look at you driving each day, and they're like, okay, is he overlapping? And they're like, no, he's not doing that. Is he speeding? Like, no, he's not doing that. Are there any problems in the car? Are the headlights out? Any defects? They're like, no. Like, okay, so what can we do? He doesn't seem he's doing anything wrong. And they're like, does he keep a rain jacket in the car? And you're like, no, I don't think so. I haven't seen any. And they're like, that's it. We're going to write a new law that every car has to have a rain jacket. And so they passed the law, and then, you're driving the next day, and they stop you like, sir, where's your rain jacket? You're like, well, what do you mean? And like, there's a law, you have to have a rain jacket. And you say, no, I don't have one. Well, what? You're under arrest. So you think, they just wrote an arbitrary law just to catch him. But that's what they did. And Daniel was aware. Now, of course, the law was not about driving, was it? It was about prayer, and it was about his religion, his faith. And they knew that Daniel would not compromise there. So they said, okay, this is what we're going to do. No one can pray to anyone except for Darius. Now, of course, the ruler is, it appeals to his pride, it appeals to his position. So they think, I can get on board with that. That everyone in my kingdom, all the people in this huge empire that we've just established, they all have to pray to me. So basically, I'm setting myself up as God. I am now the leader. I am now the divine figure within this empire. And so he agreed. And so basically he became God for a month. It was only a limited time period. But he said, that's cool, I'll do that. So the king agreed, and now the trap was set. So what Daniel would do is he would pray 3 times a day. And he would pray facing Jerusalem. Even though he has not seen Jerusalem in at least 70 years. And as far as we know, he will never return to Jerusalem. He'll never see it again. There's no record that we have that Daniel ever left Babylon and went back. But Jerusalem was still the place where he had grown up. It was still the place that he knew as the location of the temple where God lived on earth before it was broken down. And so every day he would open his window facing Jerusalem and he would pray there, remembering the place where he came from, remembering the faith that he grew up with, no matter how many years passed, no matter how long it had been. And I'm sure, when you're in your 80s and you think back to what happened when you were 12, when you were 10, when you were 8, it must become a really foggy memory. You could probably barely remember Jerusalem. But he knew the direction, and he never gave up praying to God, thanking God, and asking God for help, as our passage says, towards his homeland and towards the promised land that God had given him. And it was soon after this that Cyrus issued the decree that the Israelites could return. And people like Ezra, Nehemiah did return. And I don't know this for sure, but I believe that one of Daniel's prayers was that Israel could return, that the exile would end, and they could go back to their country, rebuild the temple, rebuild Jerusalem. And that is eventually what happened, even though Daniel did not live to see it, as far as we know. And it happened after his life. So Daniel prayed faithfully 3 times a day. Now maybe you're like me, and maybe you've read this story, and you've thought, what did Jesus say about prayer in Matthew 6? Why couldn't Daniel have just closed the window, and prayed? Why couldn't he have gone into an inside room and still prayed, as much as he wanted? Why did he have to pray prominently? And I want to read what Jesus said in Matthew 6. So in Matthew 6, verse 5, Jesus says this. He says, when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. So when I read that, and I've thought about this ever since I read the two passages. I read the one in Daniel, read the one in Matthew. It initially struck me, it seems like a good solution, yeah? I mean, you go into your room, you close the door, you're still praying to God, but you avoid getting caught. And so, they're not going to arrest you if they can't find you, and you can still continue your own devotional life. You just do it in secret. But just like with chapter 1, when Daniel refused to compromise, and just like in chapter 3, the way his friends did, he didn't go inside for the sake of hiding. And what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 6, it's about people who would pray for the sake of being recognized. It's people who would pray for their own social and, religious and societal benefit. That's why they were praying. So they were already not praying for the right reasons. They were praying so that people would think they were holy. But that's not why Daniel was praying. He was praying because it was a part of his routine, and it was something he did to remember what God had done for him in sustaining him in a foreign land. So for Daniel, it wasn't a matter of, false piety or, gaining, social points with the people around him, being thought of as more holy. And clearly, as we can see, did not benefit him. I mean, that's why he was put in jail. But that's why I don't think that those passages quite connect, even though you can imagine they do. But Daniel refused to compromise, and he broke the law intentionally. I mean, it says that after the law was signed, and when Daniel knew that the law was signed, that's when he went to pray. So even though he was fully aware that the new law had been passed, he still did it as an intentional act of civil disobedience. So he stood up against a law that he recognized as being wrong. So that even though the law was there, he did not go along with it because it did not match the law that he knew would be the law of God, the desire of God, that only God can be worshipped. And no human leader can take that place for any amount of time. And even if it's the law of the Medes and the Persians, it doesn't change. He still would not obey any law that goes against God's desire for him. So he broke it. And then comes the penalty. And the law is very simple. If you break it, you die. And they came up with a specific way to do that, by being put into the den of lions. Now, if you remember from Esther, Esther's a similar story in some ways. It also took place during the Persian Empire, at a similar time in history. And they were very particular about their laws. Once the law was written, it could not be changed. And it seemed that Darius, on some level, was a good person. Like, it seemed he didn't intend for this law to have the effect that it did. And when Daniel was brought before him, he seemed surprised. He didn't seem to realize that because he did the law, Daniel was going to be killed. And so he looked for a loophole. He looked for a way around it. So he labored all day until the sun went down. But he couldn't. He couldn't find any way around it. It was pretty straightforward. Daniel had broken it, so Daniel had to be punished. So then they moved to the lion's den because the loophole couldn't be found. So Daniel, it seems, has been taken through a promotion. He's then been taken through a problem. He's escaped. He's gone through a plot that his enemies laid for him. But he continued to pray. But what happens now is that God preserves him. And so God was able to keep his life. And so Daniel spent the entire night in the lion's den. And if you look at the two of them, between the king and Daniel, it seems that the king had a worse night than Daniel did. It says he spent the whole night without eating. He couldn't sleep. He didn't have any entertainment. And he was just agonizing over what's going on in the lion's den. Is Daniel okay? Is he going to survive? Did God save him? Did God not? Did I make the wrong decision? What's going to happen now? Did I just kill one of my best leaders that would be probably impossible to replace? What have I done? So Daniel seems to have a fine night, but the king had a sleepless night. But then he comes, first light of dawn, to see Daniel. And then Daniel says, no, I'm fine. He says, God sent an angel. It seems one angel was enough. And as we've seen from other stories, one angel can do a lot. But the angel came, kept Daniel safe. He shut the mouths of the lions, and Daniel was not touched. So last week we talked about God's deliverance. And we looked at how we cannot presume on when or how God will deliver us. And many Christians have been killed by lions. The Romans used to use lions to kill Christians. And many of them were not delivered the way that Daniel was, even though God could have. But in this case, God answered Daniel's prayer, and he kept him safe, and he delivered him miraculously, just as he's done several times throughout the book of Daniel. And once this happened, we see the consequence. We see that the king issued another decree that said that throughout his kingdom, it's only the God of Daniel who should be recognized, that he's a living God, His kingdom will never end, and he's the one who is in power. He's the only true God. So the men who accused Daniel were killed. Daniel is vindicated. Daniel is shown to be upright, and God is glorified. So this is another amazing story from Daniel that we get to experience. So what can we learn from this? Well, what does this mean for us? How can we apply this story today? So as I've reflected on the stories, I've read through it, there's a few things that came to my mind that I want to share with you. And the first lesson that I think the story can mean for us is that success is faithfulness. Success is faithfulness. And that title comes from an article I read when I was still in campus. I was still young in ministry. And I was going for a ministry retreat, and we read this article. And this article argued that the way we think of success and the way that God thinks of success is very different. And the way God measures success is through the faithfulness with what he has given us. And as you've seen from some of the stories like in Matthew, he'll ask us, did you take care of the poor? Did you take care of those in need, the orphans, the widows? You know, were you faithful with what I've given you? You know, so that when I come, you can give account for what you did with the resources and the gifts and the abilities that you have. And so we often measure success by money. We measure success by numbers, by influence, by power. And it's very difficult to move away from those metrics. Because it's easy to count things. It's easy to, measure things like, even in a church, as we start a new church, to count the attendance, to count the offering, and to use that as the measure of how well the church is doing. Because things like discipleship and things like impact and things like spiritual growth are much harder to count. They're much harder to measure. So it's easy to go into the default of looking at the best church is the biggest church, and the best church is the richest church. And it's really, and even for me, I have to keep reminding myself that that's not the measure that counts. But what matters is to be faithful. And some people in ministry, for example, they see thousands come to faith around them. They have these tremendous, worldwide, prominent, visible ministries where they're able to interact with rulers and with presidents and with kings. And they have, huge crusades. And they see tremendous results. And many people were impacted by their life and what they do. And other people labor for years in very difficult environments. And they might see hardly any converts, hardly any visible impact. But for the one who is faithful, even in a difficult place, even without the prominence and without the recognition of people around them, God will still see that ministry as just as valuable because they were faithful to what God asked them to do. And so God values the attitude. And even in giving, some people are able to give hundreds of thousands of shillings. They're able to fund entire ministries and entire churches. And of course, God values generosity. He wants us to give. But even for those of us who aren't able to do that, and we just give 1 or 2 shillings, we just give a tiny amount in comparison, God still values that sacrifice. And he still sees that that giving is also valuable. Because God doesn't just measure by size. He just doesn't measure by those metrics. So Daniel was faithful. He was faithful in small things. He was faithful in big things. And that's what made him successful. That's what made him have the value in God's eyes that he does. So success is faithfulness. And a similar lesson, the second lesson that I identified, is that character beats charisma. That character beats charisma. We've seen that success is faithfulness. But in addition to that, it's character that is more valuable than charisma. And do you know what stands out to me the most in Daniel? When I read Daniel, the thing that I actually think is the most impressive, even more so than all the stories, is the things that are not written down. And if you look at Daniel, there's a lot of gaps. And I think if you were to add up, all the events that happened in Daniel's life, I think it would come to about a week, roughly. There's a day here, there's a day here. He has some visions and dreams at the end of the book. And so you can piece together, different events that happen. But it's only about a week of time, like each event is fairly short. And if you think of his life, he lived about 90 years, at least 90 years. And so that means there's 89 years, 51 weeks or so, that are not recorded. So what happened during that time? What happened during all the other 80 years of his life, where he was just going through day by day, week by week? And I think most likely, what happened was very ordinary. It was very average. He would go to the office, he would do his work, he'd go home. Yeah? That's probably what he did most of his life. The same way most of us do that as well. And I think that it's likely that if there was, all these other amazing stories, that some of them would be included. Now, I don't know for sure. It could be that other pretty incredible things happened. But I think much of the rest of Daniel's life was average. So he went a long time between these amazing miracles that we see in the book. And only there's a few stories in this book. Most of his life is not included. And so I think for us, as we think of ordinary, everyday stuff, we think, well, I've never been in a lion's den. I've never been thrown in a fiery furnace. I've never had God deliver me from an experience like that. So my life must be so much less than Daniel's life, my impact, my value in God's eyes. But if you go through the everyday, and if you serve God faithfully, that's what God values. And that's what God cares about. And before you get to a lion's den, and after you go through a fiery furnace, there's a lot of ordinary days. And there's a lot of regular stuff that happens that isn't necessarily amazing, isn't necessarily incredible, but it's just the ordinary stuff that God works through. And this week I was reading about a shift that happened in our culture. And there's a shift that happened from a culture of character to a culture of personality. And the book I was reading kind of tracked, it's called Quiet, looking at the value of introversion and introspection. And it was saying that if you look, say, the 1800s, and up to about 1900, the culture valued certain aspects of character. And the most honorable, the people you'd want to aspire to be were people of character. But then by about 1920, there was a shift. And so the popular self-help guides, they changed their focus from inner virtue to outer charm, to know what to say and how to say it. So if you look, they did an analysis of books that were written in the 1800s. And they said in those books, the advice manuals or the manuals that were most popular, they would look at concepts like citizenship, duty, work, golden deeds, honor, reputation, morals, manners, and integrity. And that's what they saw as a society as being the most valuable. But then after about 1920 or so, from like the beginning of the 1900s, there was a shift. And when you look at the books that were published then, the things they would look at are things like being magnetic, being fascinating, being stunning, being attractive, being glowing or dominant, forceful or energetic. Now this was a shift that largely happened in the West. This is looking at America and places there. But I also think it's a shift that impacts us here. That these days we value personality more than we value character. Especially if you see who's popular on TV and in the media, in the newspaper, and so on. So like in 1899, there was a best-selling manual that was called Character, the grandest thing in the world. And it was very popular among people who wanted to grow their character. But then 20 years later, in 1921, the same author realized that there had been a shift in people's expectations. And he wrote another book called Masterful Personality, that would look at how you can build your personality, how you can become like a master salesman, how you can become more outgoing, more outspoken, and so on. And I think even today, if we think of the people we value people who are loud, people who are charismatic, people who are engaging. And those are the people that we tend to think are better leaders. We tend to think that they're the ones who should run churches, they're the ones who should run for office, they're the ones that we should trust to make decisions, and so on. And I think that distracts us from looking at character the way we once did, and the way I believe we should. And so if you have a choice between a loud, entertaining, popular leader who's always surrounded by people, who has a great following, who's very engaging, he's always entertaining, then we tend to pick that leader over someone who's quiet, someone who's unassuming, someone who's perhaps more withdrawn in a certain way, even if that person, or even if we don't even look at what kind of integrity, what kind of moral fiber, and what kind of background they each have. So I think it's a pretty dramatic shift that we've gone through. I think if you look at someone like Donald Trump, I think it's a supreme example of someone who's become popular, who's become famous, who's become wealthy, largely on the basis of his personality, largely on the basis of the things he says, his ego, and so on, with having very little character. And that should not be the qualifications for our leaders. And of course, there's many other examples that we could give of that trend. And I don't know if Daniel was a great speaker. If we look at Daniel, I don't know if he had a lot of friends. We don't know if he was married. We don't know if he had kids. We don't know what kind of social life he had. None of that stuff is told in the book. And as far as I know, we don't have any record or any evidence of those types of things. So it could be that he was a quiet guy, yeah? That he didn't have a lot of friends. He wasn't a very prominent speaker. You know, he wasn't a best-selling author in his time. You know, he wasn't the kind of person that you'd make sure was at your party. Yeah? That's possible. We don't know. But we do know that he had the character. He had the guidelines and the ability to follow through on the convictions he had and the patterns he set for his life that gave him the ability to finish well and to live a life without being tarnished. And so I really believe that character beats charisma. And between the two, we should try to develop our character more than we try to develop our persona and the way we're seen by others, the way we're perceived by others. And the last lesson I have for us, the third one, is that impact depends on convictions and much less on abilities. And if you look at Daniel, look at the impact he had, and it was tremendous. Because he was able to influence the two largest empires of his time. Empires that were opposed to God, empires that hated God, that captured God's people, and that lived very immoral lives, and that promoted a very immoral culture. But he was able to change both of those empires to having them, at the very least, recognize that the God of Israel is the God of power, and the God who delivers, the God who interprets dreams, the God who has wisdom, and the God who has all strength. He did that with the Babylonians and with the Persians. So his impact was tremendous. And I'm sure he worked hard. We know he was intelligent. We know he was gifted. But what really gave his impact, what allowed him to do what he did, is the convictions and the discipline that he had. And some of us here, all of us are gifted in different ways. And some of us have amazing abilities that sets us apart from our peers and that have allowed us to succeed in different areas, whether it's in business or whatever we've set out to do. But those abilities and those gifts that we have, they will not accomplish anything without having firm convictions behind them and without having God's help to use them in the right way. So it said that your gifts can take you before kings, but I believe it's your character that will keep you there. And it's your character that will determine how your gifts are used. So because Daniel determined to have a life of prayer, that's what allowed him to change even the most powerful people in the world, and to have prayers, like if he prayed for the exile to be ended, for his people to return to the land where they were, to establish their kingdom again, to serve God again in their homeland, that prayer was eventually answered. So next month, we're going to look at prayer in more detail. We're going to go through different aspects of prayer and what prayer means for our lives, how we can do it, and so on. So I'm not going to look at prayer too much today. But we know that prayer is very important in our walk with God. It's how we connect with God. It's how we intercede for others. It's how we keep that communion and that fellowship. It's how the Spirit works. And it's how we fight spiritual battles. So that's what prayer does. So as we conclude, I want you to reflect on your life and to think of how you lived. And I know some of us, we might have done things that we're not especially proud of. We might have different areas of regret, the way, Abby shared. And they might be bigger, they might be smaller, but I'm sure all of us have things that we need to bring to God in that respect. And that as we come before God now, and I want to close in a time of prayer. And for anyone who wants to come forward, in just a minute, I'll invite you to come forward. And I'll ask our pastors, any pastors who are here, if Pastor Tim could come up to pray with people. If Rosalind is here, I'll ask her to come forward. So if anyone wants prayer, we're going to give you a chance to do that. But I think that all of us can decide that no matter what we've done in the past, no matter what weaknesses we've had, no matter how we've compromised, no matter how we've fallen short of God's desire for us, and even our own desire for ourselves, perhaps, that we can overcome any of that. That even though we can't change the past, we can decide now how we'll seek God in the future and how we'll move forward to honor God so that all of us can reach a time in our lives when if we're 85, if we're 90, if we have enemies who are upset at our influence, at the reach that God has given us, if they look for areas of compromise in our lives, they wouldn't find it. And they wouldn't have any reason to accuse us aside from the faithfulness with which we serve God and the dedication that we have as we worship God, that would be our area of weakness, that would be our area that other people could realize they can exploit, because there's no other area that we have that they can do that with. And so I'll ask you to rise to your feet, even as we close. And so we can just take a minute to pray where you are, to come before God. If there's anything that you feel you want to bring to God, if there's any area that you know is an area of weakness, an area of shortcoming, you can bring that before God, and we can pray where we are for just a few minutes. And for anyone who wants to come forward, we're here also to pray with you. So you're welcome to come forward, and we'll take a few minutes to pray together. Passage that we've seen today, for the example of Daniel, the way that he was faithful, even in very difficult situations, the way that he continued to serve you, even in a foreign land with different empires who were in control, but he continued to trust in you, and he lived a life without compromise, and he lived a life without regret. And I pray for any of us here who are in a place of regret, where there's something we know that we've not done right, there's areas of compromise in our past, or even that are continuing. And I pray that we can overcome those with your strength, oh God, that you would set us free from anything that holds us back from living a life of the full potential that you have for us. and of fulfilling the purpose that you have for us and the desire and the impact that you have set out for us. I pray that each one of us could be faithful, O Lord, in whatever area you've given to us, however you've entrusted us with our abilities, with our gifts, with our resources. We'd be faithful in serving you with what we have, O Lord. I pray that we could develop our character, we could honor that even above other aspects of charisma or ego that may look more appealing, but I believe ultimately pale in value. And I pray that you would deepen our convictions, that we could live by the convictions that we set, oh God, and the convictions that we have from your word, the convictions of integrity, the convictions of worshiping you alone, and of not letting anything or anyone else to come into that space or to come between us and you, oh God. I pray that you could forgive us for all the ways that we've fallen short. And I know as a community, there are so many ways that we compromise, whether it's intentionally or whether it's through neglect, and that you would forgive us for that, oh God. I pray even for the sins of Karen, oh Lord, for anything wrong that's happening around us, even outside of this church. And I pray that you could forgive those as well, that we can intercede for our community, even as we intercede for our congregation, oh God, and for ourselves. We can intercede for our nation as well, and that you continue to give us favor, you continue to keep us safe, and to bring us peace as a nation, oh God. I pray that we could leave this place having been remotivated, oh God, and renewed in our conviction to serve you. I pray that you give us new strength and new passion to honor you throughout this week, in the ordinary times, in the exceptional times, and all the times in between, oh Lord. So I pray that you'd be the one who takes us forward, who directs our steps, that you would fill us with your spirit, that we would know the words that you would have us live by, oh God, and that we would live by them, oh God. That we can remove anything that distracts us or takes us away from living in the fullness of your peace and your love, oh God. I thank you for this church, for all of us who are here, and I pray that you continue to reveal yourself to us in new and fresh ways. So I do thank you again. We know that you are an awesome God. You're worthy of our praise. You continue to be with us. In Jesus' name I do pray. Amen. Amen. To approach any of us, if you'd like us to pray with you, we're still around. We'll ask that our first-time visitors would serve our tea first, and we'll have our caribou space up here. And so we'll have Pastor Tim who will meet with you, and Benson who will meet with the new visitors. And so if you're around one, please show them where our tea is, and then, yeah, you can escort them forward. So it's been great having you, and I wish you would have a wonderful week. In Jesus' name we pray.